Okay, he says, I'm supposed to say I'm Ed Hackman, and come up with some old pictures here of a house that still sits west of Bristol. But there's this first picture I'm going to pass around. I was raised a mile west of Bristol, north side of State Road 120, and lived there 50 years. I learned that the house that I lived in was part of a section owned by people named Menges. The name Menges goes back a long ways. So I learned from the book written here, Tales of Hoosier Village. In 1864, Lass and Henrietta Menges sold their property in Snyder County, Pennsylvania. If any of you done much family history, you'll discover a whole lot of us that are here now. Our ancestors came from Snyder County, Pennsylvania. They traveled by train to Bristol. Lass's brothers, the name of Harrison, John, Abraham, and Sam, moved here earlier in the 1860s, and they'd written back and told him about this. And he brought his family out here. He bought a 67-acre farm in 1864, and then in 1865, he bought another 160 acres in the same section on the St. Joe River, north side of what's now Highway 120, and it ran south to the New York Central Railroad and west to what's now County Road 21, and east to what was then known as the Palin Farm, or now part of ADEC and part of Raber's Golf Course. So he had a pretty good chunk of property out there. The first picture we just passed around is probably about 1910. It's looking east. Bristol's in the background.
Is that on 21?
That's on 120.
Oh, okay.
The house on the south side of the tracks, Highway 120, is on the north side over here.
Oh, okay. I see.
Herb Bucklen built that railroad. I always thought it started in Elkhart and came towards Bristol. Well, he had trouble buying property out west of Bristol, so the thing started somewhere east of Middlebury, and they built it in this direction.
Can I ask you something? Does that have anything to do with Pumpkin Vine? Or is that something?
No.
That's separate. It's separate.
It's separate. Pumpkin Vine was part of New York Central.
Thank you, Mother Gosh.
You want to know?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Who's right with you?
Yeah.
That wasn't the Valley Line, was it?
This is the Valley Line.
That.
And it ran from Elkhart through Bristol, Middlebury, and on over to the Ohio line. The house in the picture is a Menges home. It was said, while the railroad was being built, there's a couple old timers in Bristol, Duffy Wall told me about this, that the old girl, and maybe it's the lady in the picture, we're not sure. When the railroad was being built, the lady of the house was known to sit on the front porch with a shotgun. And she didn't like the railroad so close to the house. It was only 15, 20 feet away from her front door. And she didn't like the railroad workers, so she's keeping them away. I heard that story a number of times. I think Jim Brindley also told that story. As of this time, the house is still there. It's all modern. Since we're recording this December 2022, and that house still exists. It's all modernized.
Where's that at now?
And where is it now?
Tell.
That's,
I can see it. I can drive there and see it.
oh yeah,
Okay. Where?
it's next house west of ADEC. on the south side of the road.
Next to Kansas House.
Yeah,
The south side.
Okay.
on the south side of the road. People named it Green lived there.
Is there a blue one around there?
There's one just west of there. It's blue.
That was
Okay.
Kansas House.
Yeah.
West of there.
The man and the woman, the first names of the man and the woman in the picture, I'm not sure who they are or their first names. It's for certain they're part of the Mengeses. Lived in the house at that time. You see, this railroad went broke about 1918, and they tore out the tracks and all of that stuff. And in front of the house in the picture, it's all been filled in. It's just a gradual slope down to Highway 120 now. But assuming that the railroad put in the utility poles that you've seen in the first picture, those utility poles are still in the second picture. But the trees in the background, a couple of them have been trimmed and they've been cut, and the house is not in as good a shape as it was in the first picture. So just how long after 1918 that picture was taken, I'm not sure at all. But you can also see, obviously it was in the winter, and Highway 120, you can see where they had plowed that.
You're talking
Yeah, they
about the
did.
Valley Line, right?
This is the Valley Line Railroad, owned by Herb Bucklen. It ran in Bristol from 1910 to 1917 or 18.
That was right alongside 120. wasn't it?
Right beside it.
Next to it, yep.
In the picture, utility poles the railroad probably put in, a tree liner in the picture. Track area in front of the house in the first picture has been filled in. In 1915, one of the Menges girls by the name of Edith married a man by the name of William Morris. 5 of their children were born in this house. One of the children showed up, one of the girls showed up at that house when I was living out in that neighborhood. And she's where we got these pictures. Her last name was Cox. And no, excuse me, wrong family. Fox, like the fox.
No fox. Oh, excuse me.
Yes.
Lots of them.
And in 1929, probably due to the market crash, the whole farm was sold. And at some point, the acreage on the north side of 120 along the St. Joe River was sold in 100-foot lots, kind of a subdivision called Morris Place. This Mrs. Fox I was talking about, her maiden name was Morris. So they named it Morris Place, lots 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. Some of the names that people had bought properties along there, you'll remember some of these. Herman Harder, Holly Burke, Burke's Island.
Yep.
Burke bought property along 120 on the river, and at the end of World War II built 4 different very low price shacks.
Yeah, they were there forever.
They were there forever. I couldn't get the dang things tore down. I
Fishing
tried.
shacks in the summertime there. They were almost on the road.
Yeah.
They're almost falling into the river.
Now, not the shacks that are still there.
Oh, no.
Okay, because these weren't right on the river. Anyway, Holly Burke and one that Jack will remember, Jay Palmer.
Yeah, I remember
Jay Palmer owned quite a bit of that old farm. He owned most all of where A-Deck is. And he owned from 120 back to the railroad tracks. And he owned quite a bit of this property that Morris had divided out. He bought that up as well. So J. Palmer, his family by name is Shenefield. Hackman, of course. People by name of Redmond, Miller. On the south side of 120, there was an elderly lady lived in a one-room house by the name of Maybeck. And Leo Green, who the Green family bought the original house in 1946, and they lived there until the early 70s. On the County Road 21 side of this property, all of us know, or his kids anyway, Don Conover. When the family originally sold the farm, when they went broke, I think, 1929, part of that family built the house on County Road 21 that Don Conover ended up living in. That house is still on County Road 21. The present fire chief, Nick Cantz, Don Conover would be his great-grandfather. When the railroad went out of business, what we now call NIPSCO, Indiana Public Service, bought up the utility rights and all that right away from Elkhart all the way through Bristol. And they obtained the rights to install, maintain the poles, electric power, follow along. If you go west of town, you follow those utility poles, and you can follow that roadbed, because that is the roadbed.
That's the old 120? Or?
No, 120, it's there now. 120's always been right where it's at.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't change any.
And another road?
No. The railroad ran right beside
the
one.
railroad, okay.
The railroad right-of-way was purchased by NIPSCO.
Oh, okay.
So they'd have the rights to put in the power lines and maintain them. Mm-hmm. That runs in front of Rayburg Golf Course, in front of ADEC, across County Road 21, and continues west past the electric substation, and it crosses County Road 19. County Road 19, the Valley Line Railroad kind of veered a shade to the south and ran right beside the New York Central Main Line. That's obviously still there. That crosses the main line, and the old Valley Line Railroad crossed Middleton Run Road, County Road 13. But at that point, the Valley Line veered off a shade to what you would think would be the north, and that railroad ran right down the middle of Jackson Street into Elkhart. And
there used to be a Valley Line little breakfast place.
yeah, that went anywhere close to where the railroad is actually at.
This happened to be the same.
This happened to be the same name.
Okay.
It went anywhere close to the railroad.
Okay.
So the Valley Line went into Elkhart, and I assumed that ended up at the Bucklen Hotel, since Herb Bucklen owned that and he owned the railroads. That's a reasonable place for a thing to stop. Yeah, you can follow the right-of-way, and so I understand you get on Google Earth and look at it, you can see that railroad bed. And if you followed it east from Bristol, it was on Main Street, but it crossed over to County Road 8 and crossed where what we remember to be Bristol Pipe. It crossed that block. None of that existed.
Well, the right of way is built up there, you can still find that. Just past the old two-color
You know, you can pick it up.
on the south side.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah, through Bonneville and the railroad. The right-of-way is still in Bonneville.
Hey, Ed, when they talk about interurban railroad, what are they talking about? Which one are we talking about here?
People call it the interurban. It was actually the Valley Line.
Okay.
And so Herb Bucklen's purpose then was to carry people or goods also?
Both. But usually it's only one car at a time. There was no engine on this thing. It was electric. And the back 2/3 of the car was where the people would sit in. And they picked up milk cans and they interlocked with the New York Central. East of town, they crossed each other. So they put milk onto the railroad and the New York Central if they wanted, or it went right over, right behind the Middlebury Creamery.
What part did the old Parker interurban station, which was our grocery store when we were kids, play in this? And when we were kids, there were still tracks in Main Street when I was a little kid.
That was the railroad, except because the tracks were beside that building on Charles Street.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had a
I
place
thought
to-
the thing turned there, and that's how it went south, but it didn't.
No, that was what's it called?
The little
a
spur
garage.
line.
They worked on them there because it had an oil pit in the back of Harker's store there that they actually could drive them in there and work on it.
I didn't know that, really.
It was a kind of like a pagoda, or I mean, on the outside. Yeah, and it was well, I suppose it was 4 to 6 foot wide and had a triangle on the end of it. Of course, you'd fall in there and break a leg when you was a kid if you didn't watch yourself. So, but it was always there, and I was always under the impression that's where they worked on the interurban car if it needed oil change. Or
Very well could be. That's
Now,
where they
was that-
unloaded the freight and the
Was
people.
that behind the East End Market where Hughes' original store was?
No. Harker's grocery store, it's where the bank is, right there on the corner.
Right
Okay.
up here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ike's Barber Shop. And,
Okay. It was
The
up this way.
interurban station
that's-
became Harker's grocery store
Okay.
until the bank bought the property, and then Harker moved east.
To the East End.
Yeah,
That interurbanization, that beautiful tile roof, remember that?
it did have.
That was a neat building.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was just sitting
Stucco, white stucco.
there. Yeah.
And what happened to the building then? Is it still there? Or is it
No,
gone?
bank was tore down in the late 50s.
Where Key Bank
Or
is
the,
right now.
Oh, okay.
Interurban station was tore down in the late 50s.
So when we started out with the original farm out there by the golf course, and then Herb Bucklen wanted to buy up some right of way to run the railroad down there, was the farm owned all the way up to the river?
Oh, yes.
And so when they ran the railroad down there and 120, that took a big chunk out of that guy's land, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Either the railroad bought it or leased it, but they controlled it. And the people along there, and Midges had to be one of them. He didn't want that thing there.
I bet.
Maybe that's what helped the old lady sit there with a shotgun.
'Cause they had to get across the tracks to get out to the road, right?
Yes, you can see it here.
Now that's,
And a lot of their farm buildings was on the north side of the road. The property I owned and lived on for a long time, every now and then a horseshoe would grow out of my lawn, and a step off of a buggy grew out of my lawn one day. I found that the hard way. It's still hanging in our garage.
Yeah.